Thank you for joining us for the third edition of the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm your host, Brian Sherman, and the title of today's podcast is Which Way Will the Cybersecurity Tide Flow in 2018? Joining me today is a very special guest, Ian Thornton-Trump, security guru, Chief Technology Officer for Octopi Managed Services Incorporated. Ian, welcome to the Secure Connections podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, looking forward to today's discussion. For those that aren't familiar with Ian or haven't had the pleasure of running across him, he has a lot of expertise to share in the cybersecurity world, not just locally, but on an international basis. So I'm looking forward to some of the insight that he's able to provide the audience today. But first off, Ian, I always start with one of the most crucial questions. What is your favorite music genre? And
go ahead. Sorry. The favorite music genre is definitely electronic dance music, high tempo, lots of bass. I find that it drowns out the inane conversations that are going on around me. So it works really well.
Interesting. Is there one of the bands that you follow closely, or is it just the genre in general?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of Corella out of Chicago. Really great EDM, high tempo, high energy.
Excellent. So one other kind of question to get to know you a little better is you're another one of those who are well-traveled throughout the world in the channel. Of all the fabulous cities that you've journeyed to over the years, which is at the top of your return list?
Well, if it's information security, it's got to be London. But if it's just a fantastic place to see on this earth, it's the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean, of course, off the coast of Turkey. Very cool.
So you've been there before, I take it.
Indeed, yeah. I had a great privilege to do a tour all the way down the Aegean coast and into the Mediterranean in Turkey, and then across over to Rhodes, and it was just so remarkable. And it's an amazing sort of preserved medieval city, which are becoming more and more rare.
Great. And you mentioned London for cybersecurity. What makes London special for?
I think it's the diversity. You have everything from folks just trying to get in, graduating university, to some of the top, threat intelligence analysts working for, multi-billion-dollar organizations. And so you have such a wide sample of talent and of insight and dialogue. And then you have, the two sort of opposing media forces of sort of the Register, which is very in your face, very quippy, and then the more stately SC Magazine UK. So there's so much diversity and so much interesting stuff going on in London that it, to me, it's a big magnet.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that information. And so let's dig a little deeper into the technology and the cybersecurity space, especially your background. So first off, can you tell us a little about your entry into the channel? How did you get your start?
Yeah, so clearly when I left Canada to join, at the time it was GFI, and about 2 weeks later it became Logic Now. That was about probably 3.5 years ago now, and I hadn't really even delved into what the channel was. I didn't quite understand, the difference between what a VAR was and a reseller. We were just doing our thing in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And we were pounding on the security drum back then, but nobody was listening. Fast forward 5 years, 4.5 years later, and all of a sudden, security is becoming the story, permeating our lives, and even, I think, to a certain extent, influencing our future. So the channel, as it turned out, was very interested, of course, with huge support from ASCII and from CompTIA, turned out to be the perfect place to talk about the real experiences of small, medium business and their guardians, the MSPs and IT service providers, and their actual on-the-ground experiences, which differs from the enterprise experience, and of course, being led by organizations like Morgan Stanley, who announced that they have an unlimited cybersecurity budget.
That's never a bad thing to have.
So, no, unlimited budget, awesome.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So let's dig a little deeper. So what specifically about cybersecurity? What made you catch that bug? Because I know that's an extreme passion of yours as well.
Yeah, I think it was the sudden realization that there's a shift coming, where traditional crime, as you know, I had some exposure to crime and criminality coming from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a criminal intelligence analyst, and before that in the Canadian military police. So the shift of crime and the way crime has embraced the internet and supplemented or even made improved as a result of technology became, wait a second, we have to start thinking seriously about how we're going to deal with this threat, because the police right now in Canada, at least, went on the record and said, we're getting outmatched by these cyber criminals. Well, to be perfectly blunt, 5 years ago, the warning sign was on the wall. And so this is what the new reality of being online today is. It used to be a problem with getting, your storefront window broken and people coming in and taking your physical stuff, right? That was really easy to explain to insurance companies. What's really hard to explain to insurance companies is an unpatched server led to credit card compromisation of all your computers, right? So the entire criminal industry became internet powered, and most businesses out there were left to fend them for themselves. And I've got tons of examples of that sort of left to fend to themselves type of thing. And so as a result of that, I sort of called it upon myself to say, listen, I can help with the education, I can help with the awareness, I can help even build a product that delivers, some basic security. But there is no patch for stupid. So we find ourselves in a position where if the technology is appropriately implemented and the best practices are followed, you're a hard target for cyber criminals. Not necessarily an impenetrable target, but a hard target. That's the game as it stands right now. And that's exciting.
There's a lot of big ifs in those propositions, as well as if the processes are set up, if the technology is working, and if the people are paying attention. So excellent points. So with that in mind, let's talk about what I know you've referred to as the data breach fire to end all data breach fires, Equifax.
Right.
What lessons should be learned from that fiasco, from a channel perspective and even beyond that?
There is just so much of what not to do in this, right? When we go back and we look at like historical failings, right? I'm reminded of the PR guy for the Iraqi military, and what it was at 2003, that was basically saying that Iraq will be victorious with the M1 tank rolling by in the background of the American forces, right? Fast forward, we get to the BP oil spill in the Gulf, and we have PR standing up saying, it's a small spill, we have it under control. Meanwhile, flames, okay? Flames are rising on the horizon, right? We get to the Sony breach, the Target breaches, and stuff like this, and it was like nobody was paying attention. Everybody was clueless. Businesses had bought technology, but somehow the technology didn't come around and help them. In fact, in some cases, it's even hindered the organization because it wasn't properly implemented. I'm talking about Target had FireEye. FireEye was detecting the malware that ultimately led to the compromise of all those credit cards. And, the information and alerts that was coming out of FireEye was being ignored by the company. That blinky light box is really annoying. We're going to just ignore it. We saw Sony, where Sony had implemented some technology, some security technology, but yet they had a document called passwords.xls, easily accessible on a server, no password on it, and how do the bad guys keep getting in, right? And the most ridiculous thing about that was we potentially almost ended up in a shooting war over the Sony breach. As you recall, government got involved in what I look at as a simple intellectual property theft. And we had a ton of rhetoric that came out that was pretty darn scary emanating from a cyber attack. You've noticed subsequently that the US government has been somewhat mute when it comes to intellectual property theft and cyber espionage on civilian infrastructure, not to mention critical infrastructure, even though we know that the Lazarus Group appears to be, the consensus opinion is that they were behind the WannaCry cyber attack. But the US government has, put out a few indications of compromise, but certainly not the level of rhetoric that we saw under Sony.
Right.
With Equifax, we see a failure of management, a failure of technology, a failure of the custodial responsibility to protect data on a massive scale, right? And the shadowy relationship between where your personalized data ends up and who you give it to. And I think that was the thing that all of a sudden set the world on fire in terms of understanding where your data goes, who has it, and what they're doing to protect it. And there are probably a lot of really uncomfortable senior managers at banks right now who are complicit in the failure to hold Equifax to a standard of data protection that perhaps their banks have implemented in the wake of the Iranian hacking and the full-scale cyber criminal assaults on those institutions.
Right. I envision a lot of these companies in their car driving around with a check engine light. This is what it makes me think of. They're getting the warning signs, but nobody's pulling into the garage to get it fixed. What's it going to take to push them to that next level to where people and companies are paying attention to this? It doesn't seem like anybody really cares at this point.
So 4 months ago, I would completely agree with that premise. Now we're seeing these guys dragged into congressional testimony where a CEO who's paid millions of dollars to be essentially responsible for all company operations throw some mid-level analyst under the bus and said, yeah, that guy didn't do his job to patch that server, right? Mm-hmm. To me, if I was a congressman, and I'm going to echo one of the interrogations that happened, and it's kind of related to it, but this is how crazy naive companies are. And I wish I could remember the senator who said this. Did you not think it was a little bit strange to have a whole bunch of American ads, political ads, being bought by people paying for it in rubles? And to me, it was like that was the flaming beacon out there. If Equifax had listened to what US CERT said about Apache struts and how it was being exploited by hackers, and they were given a window of several months to address this issue and failed, that is not the responsibility of one guy. Okay?
Gotcha.
Absolutely not. So what we're going to see, I think, is a very upset public who will put pressure on their senators and their representatives. And I think we will see very similar legislation, and it's already at some state levels, right? State of California being one of the ones who is pushing the envelope in terms of holding companies responsible. They just landed a $5.3 million fine on Seagate for the hack, which was, can you please send me all the W-2s of your employees? That was the hack. And the state of California Attorney General basically said, yeah, we're going to fine you for that because you need to train your people that, sending W-2s to people that weren't authorized is a bad thing. So
Yeah.
it's the blatant obvious that I think is causing the IT industry and the information security industry to just shake their heads and go, listen, we've gone about this the entirely wrong way. The idea that we're going to live in this utopia of self-regulation and that everybody's going to do it for the betterment. I think there was a lot of 60s and 70s love going on that permeated through the 80s and 90s. And now we're getting into the 2010 where being on the internet can lead to an existential attack on your company. And we can't afford to be leaderless on this issue anymore.
Makes sense. So a lot of things need to change on the global level as well as national level with many countries. Let's just take a shift. I think those are excellent points, but let's kind of bring it a little closer to the channel here.
Okay.
With services like Amazon S3, I know we've talked about is will MSPs be capable of defending their customers when it comes to things like this in the cloud?
So MSPs have to establish themselves as the go-to resource, and they have to move away from no as a service. What they need to do is say, I will come back with a plan to architect this safely. I will come back with some ideas around how we can achieve what you want as a business without undue risk. And if they can establish that trusted advisor and build expertise or even outsource that expertise to people that know what they're doing, right? Amazon does have a certified Amazon architect certification. So if you are considering cloud services as storage or cloud services as hosted services, I would highly recommend that you look at how do I do this safely? Read some best practice documentation on this, because what we've seen is an enthusiasm to put data up into the cloud, but an assumption that we've done so safely. And these kind of continued challenges are sort of amplified. And I feel like we're always one step behind on the technology piece and understanding truly how it's going to shape our lives, right? The recent YouTube video of a guy getting high while his Tesla was on autopilot, the fact that Tesla had to come out with a response that said, you really shouldn't get high when you are responsible for being in a vehicle, going down the road at 75 miles an hour.
Sure. So you had mentioned some of the other services they need to provide. So the technology is key. I think we all acknowledge that part. There's tools here to do provide a variety of layers of protection for clients, a variety of clients. What about on the other services that MSPs should be providing? I think you alluded to it, but what other things should they be looking at or partnering with others for?
So detection of I'm going to say anomalous events, repair recovery, disaster recovery, business continuity, not just backups. Okay, backups are 5 years ago, right, when we all ran Veritas and then prayed that we could get our files back. Now we're into this full spectrum, if you will, and I think the big one is audits and pen tests and compliance and that piece of it. That's now like an add-on, right? So if we looked at detect and we looked at protect and we looked at repair recovery, that's sort of one generic service offering that many MSPs and MSSPs have gone to market with. The next one is, I'm going to say, assurance, right? Is this stuff working? If it is, how effective is it? And oh, by the way, can I get that in a report to give to my insurance company to make sure that my cyber data breach insurance policy is going to be valid? Can I get that to appease a a supplier that I'm starting to do business with that needs assurance that I'm not going to burn their house down if I send them an email. And then finally, government and state regulations, I think, are going to start looking at this. And they're going to start slowly with, do you have a user awareness training program? For instance, do you have a computer usage policy? So all of that documentation and I'm going to say kind of audit, compliance, and even maybe the pen testing will become another service envelope. And what I said at my conferences in Amsterdam, London, and Orlando, Florida, was quite simply, if you're the provider of the security services, you can't be the evaluator of those security services. So there, in the channel, there's a real need, if you want to say blue MSP and red MSP, for red team and blue team, you got the blue guys that are delivering the security services to the businesses. You've got the red MSPs that are going to go in and evaluate it or pen test it to see how they're doing. And together with those two combinations, we win, right? Everybody wins. The business has what they need to meet those compliance and regulatory. The MSP has the assurance that the services that they're providing, and that other MSP, they can swap roles, right? And everybody can make a little bit of money.
Very good. I think that makes sense. The partnership opportunity, that's where a lot of the MSPs seem to struggle, is determining whether to build it themselves. As you mentioned, there's components, especially on the third-party assessment side, where they should be separate and working together for the same cause. But they struggle kind of to figure out, what is my exact role and what things should I be building and what things should I be partnering? And I know there's no perfect answer for that, but are there any additional recommendations you'd make in that area?
So I think it comes down to, we're now in a realm where if your contract for services is, we'll just do computer stuff and security stuff, that's too airy-fairy. And what will happen is when there's an incident, you'll get blamed. The default will be the service provider gets blamed. So in order to kind of survive that kind of encounter, MSPs need to articulate their services. They need to have KPIs and evidence that they're delivering that service. And then all of a sudden, if things go sideways with the customer, they're in a position where if it ever goes to litigation or court, or a regulatory agency gets involved, they can put up their hands and say, okay, here's all of our service tickets. Here's the recommendations we made that the customer rejected. Here's all the evidence of our due diligence. And at that point, the MSP will escape relatively unscathed. I say relatively because anytime you have to pull out the contract or end up in court, everybody loses, right?
Sure.
It's now about mitigating that risk as an MSP. And I think having a third-party evaluation, like you touched on, becomes a really great document, a roadmap document, evidence of due diligence. Even if the evaluation comes back really not favorable, you now have an opportunity to improve, because if the next evaluation isn't people that you have a contract with or paying to do it, i.e. cyber criminals, it will have real impact. So I like to say pretend data breach is way better than real data breach.
Gotcha. Makes perfect sense. So let's shift gears a little bit here to talk about the Internet of Things. IoT botnets. That I know is a concern. It should be a growing concern as we're connecting more and more devices, and it'll probably be a plethora of or an explosion of growth over the next few years. Are we even capable of detecting compromises? And are there any tools that can help in this area?
Yeah, so the issue right now that we're faced with, again, and this is where MSPs have a huge role to play, is when they are considering, their customers are asking them to go and do something IoT, be it a new telephone system or a camera system or DVRs or any of that Internet of Things stuff. The MSP should be the first and last call for that business. The MSP should look at what the options are and be thinking about the security. How can I secure that from the bad things that are on the internet? we have the ability collectively, the MSPs, and through the association, for instance, of the IoT Security Services Association, to start looking at what a good IoT device is, i.e., one that demands that you set a robust password when you turn it on, versus something that the manufacturer is no longer around. There are no patches forthcoming, and it uses a Linux kernel from 4 years ago. Okay, so we have a chance here to actually fix the problem at I'm going to say at the ground level. In the air, over top of all of this, the U.S. government is contemplating more robust rules around IoT devices. And everybody right now is looking at the automotive industry as well as the medical device industry after some difficulty in convincing the medical device industry that it needed to address some pretty horrific vulnerabilities in different devices. And then, of course, another big Internet of Things is the integrity of electronic voting systems, as illustrated at DEF CON. So where we are right now is we're on the horizon where everyone knows that it's a problem. Everyone is struggling a bit with what the easiest way to solve it is. I suggest that the easiest way to solve it is by making smart choices for your customers. That will incrementally improve the situation if we can get the word out to MSPs. Now comes the sticky part. The sticky part is what happens when somebody else's device is attacking you and you're kind of helpless to deal with it. This is one of the problems we haven't figured out yet, but there are a bunch of working groups talking about, cutting off parts of the internet that are showing signs of massive attacks percolating or coming through across the internet and hitting the carriers, which in turn would hit the end user businesses. So there is a discussion on, I'm going to say, how to deal with the consequences of the poor choices that we've made in terms of what we're putting on the internet. But it's really, I think, the poor choices part that will start fixing the problem.
Gotcha. So we're moving in the right direction, but it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done as they build out the infrastructure and the technologies over the years.
Yeah, and I just want to give you a great parallel. I mean, we invented the car. We made cars go faster. And then we discovered that people were getting killed because they were thrown out of the cars when the cars crashed. So we built seatbelts. And that's had a dramatic effect on the amount of fatalities, right?
Right.
We're at this same sort of process now, I think, where if you take a device and you put it on the internet, no matter how secure by design it was when it was put on the internet, as vulnerabilities emerge, as technology decays, as the cyber criminals innovate and new attacks are developed, we need to respond or control these devices. And if we relinquish that responsibility over the life cycle of the device, then we have the problem of where that device is no longer working for you. It's working for somebody you don't know, and they're probably not a nice person.
Definitely understand. So IoT is one of the things to be looking at, be paying attention to, especially from an MSP perspective. But looking at 2018 and beyond, what do you think is going to be the bigger concern or other big concerns that are coming along for businesses?
Well, I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, we're going to see technology lifecycle management really work in our favor. If I was an MSP right now, I would double my price for anyone not running Windows 10 and maybe give an incentive discount if the customer says, hey, we want to move our systems to Windows 10. And the reason why I say this is that I looked at the latest Creators Edition of Windows 10, and there's about 5 security technologies that they're now baking in. Okay, so full disk encryption is now available, application whitelisting is now available, and relatively easy to set up. Okay, so those are 2. App whitelisting being one of the most effective cybersecurity tools there is, according to the Australian DSD and the SANS/CIS 20. Okay, now you have attack surface reduction, so the EMET capability, which was a module that Microsoft produced to try and keep applications in a sandbox from running amok. We have a massively improved a Windows Defender AV component that is now available in the system. And we have this thing that they're calling folder permissions that are really looking at an application that's trying to make adjustments on your configuration. So it's kind of like built-in lock-in configuration management on a machine, right? So in my mind, if somebody came to me and said, Ian, I've got 100 endpoints, what's the biggest thing I can do in terms of security? I would be roll out a Windows 10 upgrade project. And then I would be, here's the great thing about an upgrade project. You get to fix all the things that you kind of let slip by years ago, right? Because you just get to say the words that every IT guy loves to say to their customers, which is, it's Windows 10, so it kind of has to be that way. And that way, you can fix a whole bunch of things that were inherited from Windows 7, possibly Windows 8 or Vista even. And you can now move that needle a little bit closer to the security nirvana. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that we can do, especially when you combine that with vulnerability management and auto updating and credential control. And now all of a sudden we've taken that business that might be wide open with their Windows 7 and there's Windows XP environment, and we've now made them a darn hard target to attack, which will force the bad guys to use social engineering-based attacks, which you can mitigate by end user training. So I feel like in 2018, it's infrastructure game, it's repairing and getting rid of the legacy of poor life choices that we made early on, and putting in a little bit more of that layered cybersecurity defense, even if it might be a little bit more inconvenient for the end users.
So it sounds like setting technology standards, process standards, and also assessment and periphery standards for clients is something that MSPs should be a little more firm about maybe than they have in the past. I know many technicians or many MSPs are responding to their customers' needs, where in this case they may need to be more proactive and say this needs to happen and this is why. The education of the customers, is that something that you would stand behind as well?
Absolutely, because here's the great thing. If you're going to build something that's going to survive, it has to have a good foundation. The customer doesn't understand the foundation. To them, a network jack is a network jack and a switch is a switch. Sure. Right? It's the MSPs that bring that knowledge to the table and say, listen, we want to isolate your point of sale system from the rest of the network because that's a compliance requirement, but also it makes it really hard for the bad guys to hack your point of sale system. So if an MSP can go in with a plan to do that and says, here's the value, and oh, by the way, I'll incentivize you in terms of your monthly pricing. I will, execute this project, as effectively as I can. The MSP has to realize that that's value add to them, right? Looking after customers is good for business. Securing customers is even better for business. So if they can get that through sort of their minds, that the project to secure a customer reduces support costs at that customer, i.e. profitability goes up. If they can do MSP math, I think 2018 will be very successful for MSPs.
Great. Well, Ian, before we close, any parting thoughts on the cybersecurity threat landscape?
The big one that I have for practitioners and MSPs is please pay attention to what is going on, what is coming out of US CERT, what is coming out of ISAC, which is the Multi-State Information Assurance Association, Sharing Association. All of that data is when US CERT says you need to patch this, you need to patch this. It's the government telling you that you need to do something. So pay attention to that would be my advice. And I think the next thing is participate in the debate. If you find a new device and it has a vulnerability or it has something ridiculous, like, a hard-coded password, for instance, tell everybody about that, okay? Because at the end of the day, collectively, if we band together, we can deal with this cyber problem. But if we stand out there alone, and to give you a military analogy, if you stand out there alone, chances are you're going to get picked off, right? But if we move together and we cover each other and we exchange information and knowledge, then all of a sudden we become a lot more effective at dealing with what that threat is out there. And the nice thing about it is maybe our group will be able to pick off some of the guys that aren't working, in teams over there, and we can actually rack up a few wins. And I think we're seeing that in law enforcement today. We're seeing some good takedowns. We're seeing attacks on the money laundering of the proceeds of cybercrime, which are ultimately more effective than going after, a person installing an ATM skimmer and things like that. So I think that, the real messages are pay attention to what's going on, enter into the debate and out, insecure products, and report cybercrime and share information.
Excellent insight. With that, I would like to thank Ian Thornton-Trump for sharing his insight with us today. And stay tuned as well. He will be a regular contributor on the IoTSSA website in our web sessions as well as podcasts in the future. Be sure to join us for our next episode of the Secure Connections podcast, when we'll be joined by Patrick Albert of Avik. And on behalf of IoTSSA, I'd like to thank you for listening today and encourage you to check out all the great channel cybersecurity content on the association's website. Go to IoTSSA.com for more information. Have a phenomenal day, and thank you once again.